The melody did not simply continue. It deepened, unfolding with a quiet authority that could not be mistaken for chance. Each phrase revealing a level of control and emotional precision that belonged to a world far beyond casual performance. And somewhere between the rising harmonies and the delicate restraint of her touch, the room began to understand that they were witnessing something they could not easily explain. Evelyn Carter's fingers moved across the keys with effortless clarity, not fast for the sake of impressing, not slow for the sake of drama, but exactly as the music demanded, as if she were not interpreting the piece, but remembering it, recalling something etched into her being long before this night, long before this stage. The sound filled the hall, not loudly, not aggressively, but completely, wrapping around the audience with a presence that felt both intimate and undeniable. A man in the front row leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his expression no longer casual but intent, as if he were trying to catch something slipping just beyond his understanding. A young student near the aisle pressed her hands together, her earlier confidence replaced by quiet awe, her eyes fixed on Evelyn as if seeing a different reality unfold in real time. Even the air seemed to shift, carrying each note with a weight that lingered just long enough to leave an imprint before dissolving into the next. Alexander Graves stood closer now, his position no longer one of distant control but of reluctant proximity, drawn in by something he could not dismiss, something that refused to align with his expectations. His jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in concentration, his mind searching through years of training, through countless performances, trying to categorize what he was hearing, trying to place it within the framework he trusted. But the framework did not hold. There was a phrasing in Evelyn's playing, a subtle bending of time within the measure, a way she allowed silence to speak just as clearly as sound, that felt familiar in a way that unsettled him, as if a memory were pressing against the edges of his awareness without fully revealing itself. His fingers twitched at his side, an unconscious reaction, as if part of him wanted to reach for the piano, to test the reality of what he was hearing, to confirm that it was not some illusion created by the unexpected. Evelyn's expression remained calm, her gaze steady, her focus entirely within the music, untouched by the shifting energy around her. She did not look at the audience. She did not acknowledge the maestro standing just feet away. She played as if none of it existed, as if the hall were empty, as if the only thing that mattered was the truth within the notes themselves. The melody began to climb, not dramatically, but with a quiet inevitability, building tension not through force but through precision, each transition perfectly balanced, each dynamic controlled with an understanding that could not be taught in any classroom. The audience felt it before they understood it, a tightening in the chest, a stillness that held them in place, unwilling to break the fragile connection forming between performer and sound. A woman in the third row exhaled slowly, unaware that she had been holding her breath. Somewhere in the back, a man who had arrived late and taken his seat with casual indifference now sat completely still, his earlier distractions forgotten, his attention captured without resistance. Alexander took another step forward, his polished shoes silent against the floor, his eyes narrowing further as recognition began to take shape, not fully formed, not yet undeniable, but present enough to disturb the certainty he had carried into this moment. There was a passage approaching, one that required not only technical mastery, but a level of emotional control that separated performers from true artists, a passage he had spent years perfecting, refining, claiming as his own signature interpretation. He watched closely, expecting to see hesitation, expecting to witness the point where this illusion would break, where reality would reassert itself and confirm what he believed to be true. Evelyn did not hesitate. Her hands moved with absolute confidence, her touch shifting seamlessly as the passage unfolded, each note placed with intention, each silence held with purpose, the entire sequence executed with a clarity that left no room for doubt. The effect was immediate. A subtle ripple moved through the audience, not of noise, but of realization, as if something unspoken had just been confirmed in the collective mind of the room. Alexander's breath caught, just slightly, his composure holding, but only just, as the recognition he had resisted began to sharpen, taking form in a way he could no longer ignore. This was not unfamiliar. This was not accidental. And as Evelyn carried the melody forward, her presence unwavering, her control absolute, the truth began to press closer, inevitable and undeniable, waiting for the moment when it would no longer remain hidden. The passage resolved with a softness that did not fade but settled, like the final breath of something ancient and complete, and for a moment no one in the hall moved. No one dared to break the fragile stillness that had taken hold, because what they had just heard did not feel like a performance that ended. It felt like something that continued beyond sound, lingering in a space they could not quite define. Evelyn Carter's hands remained lightly resting on the keys, her fingers no longer moving, yet the presence of her playing still filled the room, as if the piano itself remembered what had just passed through it. Then, slowly, she lifted her hands and placed them gently in her lap, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, as though nothing extraordinary had occurred. The silence deepened. It was no longer anticipation. It was realization. A man near the center of the hall blinked as if waking from a dream, his lips parting slightly, but no words came. A woman in the front row lowered her gaze, her eyes glassy, as though she had been reminded of something she had forgotten long ago. The absence of applause was not hesitation. It was reverence. Alexander Graves stood completely still, his breath measured but shallow, his mind no longer searching for errors, no longer analyzing technique, because the framework he had relied on had already collapsed. His eyes remained fixed on Evelyn, not with authority now, but with something far more uncertain, something that bordered on recognition. His lips parted slightly, as if to speak, but no sound followed. The room waited, not for him, but for what would come next, because even in silence, it was clear that something had shifted beyond performance, beyond expectation, into a truth that demanded acknowledgement. Alexander took one slow step closer, then another, until he stood beside the piano, close enough to see the subtle stillness in Evelyn's hands, the quiet steadiness in her breathing. He studied her face more carefully now, not as an observer, but as someone searching through time, through memory, trying to align what he saw with something buried deep within his past. His voice, when it finally came, was quieter than anyone had ever heard it, stripped of its usual command. That phrasing, he said slowly, each word measured, as if chosen with care he was not accustomed to needing. Where did you learn that? The question did not carry accusation. It carried uncertainty. Evelyn did not answer immediately. She looked at the keys for a brief moment, her gaze soft, almost reflective, before lifting her eyes to meet his for the first time. There was no challenge in her expression, no pride, only a calm recognition, as if she had been expecting this moment long before it arrived. It is not something you learn, she said gently, her voice steady and clear, carrying through the silent hall without effort. It is something you remember. A faint ripple moved through the audience, not of sound, but of understanding that something deeper was unfolding, something that extended beyond the music they had just heard. Alexander's brow tightened slightly, the words settling into him in a way he could not dismiss, because they touched something he had not revisited in years, something he had chosen, perhaps, to leave behind. He searched her face again, more urgently now, his composure slipping just enough to reveal the tension beneath. That passage, he continued, his voice lower still, the timing, the restraint, the way you held the silence before the resolution, that is not written that way. Evelyn's expression did not change, but there was a quiet depth in her eyes now, something that suggested the weight of years, of experience, of truths carried without display. No, she replied softly, it is not. The room held its breath again, but this time it was not for the music. It was for the space between them, for the conversation unfolding without spectacle, without performance, yet carrying more intensity than anything that had come before. Alexander's certainty, once unshakable, now stood on uncertain ground, and the realization pressed closer, clearer, impossible to ignore. He took a slow breath, his gaze sharpening as memory began to surface, fragments aligning, patterns forming, until the unspoken truth hovered just beneath the surface, waiting. And in that moment, as the silence stretched and the weight of recognition grew heavier, it became undeniable that the woman he had dismissed, the presence he had overlooked, was not an interruption to his world. She was part of its foundation. The realization did not arrive all at once. It pressed forward slowly, like a memory forcing its way through years of careful distance. And Alexander Graves felt it before he fully understood it, a quiet fracture in the certainty he had built his entire reputation upon. He studied Evelyn Carter with an intensity that no longer belonged to a performer judging an amateur, but to a student standing on the edge of recognition, searching for the truth he had once known but chosen to forget. The hall remained completely still. The audience now witnesses not to a performance, but to something far more personal, something unfolding beneath the surface of polished appearances and carefully constructed identities. Evelyn did not look away. She met his gaze with a calm steadiness that held no accusation, no need for validation, only the quiet presence of someone who understood exactly what this moment meant. Alexander's voice, when it returned, carried a subtle shift, the sharp authority softened by something unfamiliar, something closer to hesitation. There was only one person, he said slowly, almost to himself, who ever played it that way. The words hung in the air, fragile, incomplete, yet heavy with implication. A faint murmur moved through the audience, not loud enough to break the silence, but enough to signal that they felt the weight of what was being uncovered. Evelyn's expression remained unchanged, but there was a depth in her eyes now, a quiet acknowledgement that needed no confirmation. Alexander took another step back, not in retreat, but in adjustment, as if the space between them had shifted into something he no longer controlled. His mind moved quickly, pulling fragments from years past, from lessons that had shaped him, from a presence that had once guided him with patience he had not fully appreciated at the time. A small studio. Early mornings. The sound of the same passage played over and over again, not until it was perfect, but until it was understood. He could almost hear the voice now, calm, unwavering, correcting not his technique, but his intention. "Do not rush the silence," she had said. "That is where the truth lives." His breath caught, the memory no longer distant, no longer abstract. It was here. It was standing in front of him. He looked at Evelyn again, this time not searching, but seeing, and the final piece fell into place with a quiet certainty that left no room for doubt. "Evelyn," he said, the name unfamiliar on his lips in this context, yet undeniably correct. "Carter was not the name you used." It was not a question. It was a recognition. A ripple of shock passed through the room, subtle but undeniable, as the audience leaned forward, drawn into the revelation they could now feel building. Evelyn allowed a small pause, not for effect, but as if acknowledging the distance between who she had been and who she had chosen to become. Then she spoke, her voice soft, but carrying clearly through the silent hall. "Names change," she said gently. "Understanding does not." The simplicity of the words settled into the space with a weight that far exceeded their length. Alexander's composure shifted again, not dramatically, but enough to reveal what had been hidden beneath years of control. Respect. Not the performative kind he had displayed on stages around the world, but something quieter, something earned, something he had not felt in a very long time. "You disappeared," he said, his voice lower now, no longer addressing the audience, but the woman before him. "After everything, after what you built, you just vanished." Evelyn's gaze softened slightly, not with regret, but with acceptance. "I did not vanish," she replied. "I stepped away." The distinction was small, but it carried a truth that resonated beyond the words themselves. The audience remained silent, completely absorbed. The earlier hierarchy of the room dissolved into something far more equal, far more human. Alexander lowered his eyes briefly, a gesture so subtle it might have gone unnoticed on any other night. But here, in this moment, it spoke volumes. He had spent years building a name, a reputation, a legacy that stood on stages like this one. Yet standing here now, he was reminded of where it had truly begun, of who had shaped the foundation he had so confidently claimed as his own. He looked back up at Evelyn, the distance between them no longer defined by status, but by something far more honest. "I thought," he began, then paused, the words catching as if they required more care than he was used to giving. "I thought I had moved beyond those lessons." Evelyn's expression remained steady, but there was a quiet understanding in her eyes, as if she had heard this before, not from him, but from many who had walked a similar path. No one moves beyond them, she said softly. They either carry them with humility, or they forget why they mattered. The words did not accuse. They revealed. And in the silence that followed, Alexander Graves understood something that no performance, no applause, no recognition had ever truly given him. The room did not need to speak. The truth had already been heard. The silence that followed her words did not feel empty. It felt full, as if every person in the hall was holding something they had not expected to confront. And for Alexander Graves, that weight settled deeper than he could have imagined, pressing against the identity he had spent years refining, polishing, presenting to the world as complete. He stood there beside the piano, no longer the center of the room, no longer the unquestioned authority, but a man, standing face to face with the origin of his own foundation. The shift was subtle, but undeniable. The audience felt it. They saw it in the way his posture changed, in the way his shoulders lowered just slightly, not in defeat, but in recognition, in the quiet acknowledgement that something within him had been corrected. Evelyn Carter remained seated, her hands resting gently in her lap, her presence steady, unchanged, as if she had not just altered the entire dynamic of the room, as if this moment was not about proving anything, but simply revealing what had always been true. Alexander drew in a slow breath, the kind that comes when a person realizes they must choose their next words carefully, not for the sake of performance, but for the sake of honesty. He turned slightly toward the audience, then paused, as if reconsidering, as if understanding that whatever needed to be said did not belong to them first. It belonged here, in this space between him and Evelyn. I spent years, he began, his voice quieter than before, but carrying with a clarity that commanded attention without force, trying to refine what you taught me, trying to make it my own, to elevate it, to surpass it. He stopped for a brief moment, the admission hanging in the air, unprotected, unpolished. A few heads in the audience tilted slightly, sensing the vulnerability in a man they had only ever seen in control. Evelyn did not react outwardly, but her gaze remained fixed on him, calm, attentive, allowing the moment to unfold without interruption. Somewhere along the way, Alexander continued, his voice tightening just enough to reveal the weight behind it. I stopped listening to the silence you spoke about. I filled it. I shaped it. I controlled it. And I believe that was mastery. The words settled into the hall with a quiet force, not dramatic, but undeniable, because they carried truth that extended beyond music. A faint shift moved through the audience, not of sound, but of understanding, as if they were witnessing not just a revelation, but a correction. Evelyn inclined her head slightly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, as if she had been waiting for him to arrive at this point on his own. Control is easy, she said softly, her voice steady, carrying through the stillness without effort. Understanding is not. The simplicity of the statement cut through the complexity of everything he had built, reducing it to something far more fundamental. Alexander let out a small breath, almost a quiet exhale of realization, his gaze lowering for a moment before returning to her, clearer now, more grounded. Why did you leave? He asked, the question no longer driven by confusion, but by a need to understand something deeper, something that had shaped both of their paths in ways he was only now beginning to see. The room held its breath again, the audience leaning into the silence, aware that this answer carried more than personal history. Evelyn considered the question, not because she needed time to think, but because she understood the weight of the moment, the importance of what was being asked. Because the world does not need more noise, she said gently. It needs people who remember how to listen. Her words settled into the space like a quiet truth that no one could argue, not because it demanded agreement, but because it resonated in a place beyond logic. Alexander absorbed this slowly, the meaning unfolding within him, connecting to the realization that had already begun to take shape. He glanced briefly at the piano, then back at Evelyn, and for the first time that evening, his expression held something that had been absent before. Not pride, not control, respect, genuine, unguarded respect. I did not recognize you, he said, his voice steady now, but softer, stripped of the authority it once carried so easily. Not when you walked in, not when you sat there. He paused, the words catching not from uncertainty, but from the weight of their truth. I dismissed you. The admission did not echo loudly, but it carried further than any performance that night. Evelyn's expression remained calm, unchanged, but there was a quiet acceptance in her gaze, as if this was not something new, not something unique to him, but something she had encountered many times before. Most people do, she replied, her tone neither bitter nor forgiving, simply honest. The room fell into a deeper silence, one that did not demand reaction, because the lesson had already landed, not through confrontation, but through revelation. And as Alexander Graves stood there, no longer above the moment but fully within it, he understood something that no stage, no applause, no title had ever taught him. The greatest measure of mastery was not how well you were seen. It was how deeply you were willing to see. The weight of his admission lingered in the air, not as a moment of shame, but as a turning point that no one in the room could ignore. And for the first time that evening, Alexander Graves did not try to reclaim control of the moment. He allowed it to exist exactly as it was, unpolished, unprotected, and undeniably real. The audience remained silent, not because they were unsure how to respond, but because they understood that anything they added would diminish what had already been revealed. Evelyn Carter rose slowly from the piano bench, her movement calm and deliberate, her presence unchanged by the shift in power that had just taken place, as if recognition held no more weight for her than dismissal ever had. She placed one hand lightly on the edge of the piano, her fingers brushing the polished surface for a brief moment, not out of attachment, but out of familiarity, as if acknowledging something that had been a part of her long before this room, long before this night. Alexander watched her closely, his gaze no longer searching, no longer questioning, but learning, absorbing every subtle detail with a focus he had not allowed himself in years. I built everything I am, he said quietly, his voice steady but stripped of its former certainty, on what you gave me. The words were not a declaration of pride. They were a recognition of origin. Evelyn turned slightly toward him, her expression soft but grounded, her eyes holding a quiet clarity that seemed to steady the entire room. You build it on what you chose to keep, she replied gently, and on what you chose to forget. The distinction settled into him immediately, precise and undeniable, because it spoke not only to his success, but to the distance he had placed between himself and the foundation that made it possible. A subtle shift moved through the audience again, a collective understanding that this was no longer about music, no longer about performance, but about something far more human, something that reached into the choices people made when no one was watching. Alexander glanced down at his hands, the same hands that had commanded stages across the world, the same hands that had shaped interpretations praised by critics and celebrated by audiences, and for a moment, he saw them differently, not as instruments of mastery, but as extensions of lessons he had not fully honored. He lifted his gaze again, this time with a clarity that had been absent before, and there was no hesitation in his voice when he spoke. Then I need to remember, he said simply. The statement did not carry drama. It carried intention. Evelyn studied him for a brief moment, not evaluating, not judging, but acknowledging the shift that had taken place, the quiet decision that would define what came next. She nodded once, a small gesture that held more meaning than any elaborate response, as if granting permission not to her, but to the truth he had finally allowed himself to face. Alexander stepped back from the piano, creating space not as a retreat, but as an offering, an unspoken recognition that the moment no longer belonged to him. He turned slightly toward the audience, his posture no longer elevated, no longer distant, but grounded, present. What you heard tonight, he said, his voice carrying through the hall with a clarity that required no projection, was not a demonstration. It was a reminder. The words settled into the room with a quiet force, drawing every listener deeper into the moment. We spend years chasing perfection, he continued, refining technique, building reputation, seeking recognition, and somewhere along the way, we forget the simplest thing we were ever taught. He paused, not for effect, but because the weight of what he was saying required space to land. To listen. The room remained still, the audience absorbing not just the words, but the transformation behind them, the shift from authority to understanding that had unfolded before their eyes. Evelyn stood beside the piano, her presence steady, unaffected by the attention now resting on her. as if this moment was not an achievement, but a continuation of something she had always carried quietly. A young student near the front leaned forward slightly, her expression filled with a kind of focus that had not been there before, as if something within her had been awakened, something that would remain long after the night ended. An older man in the back row lowered his head briefly, his thoughts turning inward, reflecting on moments he had overlooked, voices he had dismissed, truths he had not fully heard. Alexander glanced back at Evelyn once more, and this time there was no distance in his gaze, no hierarchy, only recognition and respect that needed no further confirmation. The hall did not erupt into applause. It did not need to, because in that quiet, in that shared stillness, something far more lasting had taken place. And for everyone present, whether they understood it fully or not, the meaning was clear. Mastery was never about being seen above others. It was about remembering what you once overlooked and having the humility to listen when it returned. No one moved, not at first, because the moment did not feel finished. It felt suspended, as if the room itself understood that what had just taken place could not be followed by something ordinary. And in that fragile stillness, every person present became aware of something they had not expected to confront within themselves. Evelyn Carter stepped away from the piano with the same quiet composure she had carried from the beginning, her movements unhurried, her presence untouched by the shift in attention that now surrounded her, as if recognition had no more meaning to her than anonymity ever had. The polished floor reflected her steps as she moved toward the edge of the stage, the soft echo of her shoes marking each moment with a clarity that seemed louder than any applause could have been. Alexander Graves remained where he stood for a brief second longer, his eyes following her, not out of authority, but out of understanding, as if he knew that allowing her to leave without acknowledgement would undo everything he had just realized. He took a step forward, then another, his voice breaking the silence not with command, but with intention. Evelyn. The name carried across the hall, steady and clear, and for the first time that evening, it was spoken not as a question, but as a recognition fully accepted. She paused, turning back slowly, her expression calm, her gaze meeting his without hesitation. The audience leaned in almost imperceptibly, drawn into the final thread of a moment that had already changed more than they could articulate. Alexander stood facing her, no longer separated by stage or status, but connected by something far more honest. "Stay," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. "Just for a moment longer." The request did not carry expectation. It carried respect. Evelyn considered him for a brief moment, her eyes steady, as if measuring not the words, but the intention behind them. Then she gave a small nod and remained where she stood, neither returning to the piano nor stepping away, simply present. Alexander turned toward the audience once more, but this time his posture was different, not elevated, not distant, but grounded in a way that felt unmistakably real. "Tonight," he began, his voice carrying through the hall with a calm clarity, "we were reminded that greatness does not always arrive the way we expect it." A faint shift moved through the room, a collective acknowledgement that what he was saying was not a performance, but a truth unfolding in real time. "We look for it in reputation, in titles, in appearances," he continued, "and sometimes we overlook it when it is sitting quietly right in front of us." His words did not accuse the audience. They included them, and in that inclusion, there was no resistance, only reflection. A man in the second row lowered his gaze slightly, as if replaying the moment Evelyn had first walked down the aisle, realizing now what he had missed. A young student near the front held her breath, her expression thoughtful, as if the lesson had reached deeper than she expected. Alexander glanced briefly toward Evelyn, then back to the audience, his voice softening just enough to carry a weight that did not need volume. "I have spent years being introduced as a master," he said, "but tonight, I was reminded what that word truly means." The statement settled into the space with quiet power, not because it redefined him, but because it revealed him. The room remained silent, fully present, fully aware that what they were witnessing extended beyond music, beyond performance, into something far more lasting. Evelyn stood with quiet dignity, her presence neither demanding nor diminishing the moment, but completing it in a way that could not be replaced. Alexander took a slow breath, then stepped aside, not dramatically, but deliberately, clearing the space in front of the piano as if offering it back to its true purpose, not as a stage for ego, but as a place for truth. He did not gesture grandly. He did not announce anything further. He simply stepped aside. The meaning was clear without explanation. The audience felt it immediately, a subtle shift in understanding that required no words, no direction, only awareness. Evelyn looked at the piano once more, then back at Alexander. And in that brief exchange, something unspoken passed between them, something that did not need acknowledgement because it already existed. She did not return to the bench. She did not play another note. Instead, she inclined her head slightly, a gesture of quiet closure, and turned toward the aisle once more. This time, as she walked, the room responded, not with loud applause, not with interruption, but with something far more profound. People stood, slowly, one by one, not prompted, not coordinated, but moved by something they could not fully explain. The sound of chairs shifting filled the hall, a soft, collective motion that carried more respect than any ovation could have achieved. Alexander remained still, watching her as she walked away, his expression no longer marked by authority, but by understanding that had been earned in silence. And as Evelyn Carter reached the back of the hall and disappeared beyond the doors, the room did not rush to fill the space she left behind. Because for the first time that evening, everyone understood that what mattered most had already been heard. The doors at the back of the hall closed softly behind Evelyn Carter, and the faint echo of that sound lingered longer than it should have, as if the room itself was reluctant to let the moment end. Yet there was no rush to fill the silence she left behind, no immediate applause, no attempt to return to the scheduled program, because something deeper had already taken place, something that did not require continuation. Alexander Graves remained standing near the piano, his posture still, his gaze fixed on the space where she had disappeared, as if part of him understood that what had just happened would not repeat itself, that moments like this did not return on command. They arrived only when they were needed, and only when someone was ready to see them. The audience slowly lowered themselves back into their seats, the soft sound of movement replacing the earlier stillness. But even as they settled, no one spoke, no one reached for their phones, no one broke the quiet reflection that now filled the hall. A woman in the front row pressed her hands together gently, her expression thoughtful, as if replaying the music in her mind, but hearing something different now, something she had not noticed before. A young student sat upright, her eyes focused not on the stage, but inward, as if something within her had shifted, something that would follow her long after this night ended. An older man near the aisle adjusted his glasses slowly, his movements deliberate, as if he needed time to process not what he had seen, but what he had failed to see at first. Alexander finally exhaled, a quiet breath that marked the end of something within him, not a loss, but a release, the kind that comes when a person recognizes the limits of what they thought they understood. He turned back toward the piano, his reflection faintly visible on its polished surface, and for a brief moment, he saw not the figure the world had come to admire, but the student he had once been, sitting in a small room, listening, learning, being corrected not in skill, but in perception. He reached out and placed his hand lightly on the edge of the instrument, his touch careful, almost reverent, as if acknowledging that it was not the piano that had changed, but his understanding of what it meant to play it. The stage no longer felt like a place to perform. It felt like a place to remember. He stepped back slowly, not turning his back on the audience, but no longer seeking their attention, his presence quieter now, more grounded, as if the need to be seen had been replaced by something far more enduring. The program for the evening remained unfinished, but no one questioned it. No one asked for continuation, because what they had experienced had already surpassed expectation, already redefined what the night was meant to be. A member of the conservatory staff stood near the side, uncertain for a moment, then lowered her clipboard, understanding without instruction that there was nothing left to organize, nothing left to manage. The moment had completed itself. Outside, the night air waited beyond the doors, cool and still, carrying the distant hum of the city, but inside the hall, time seemed to move differently, slower, more deliberate, as if allowing each person the space to absorb what had just unfolded. Alexander glanced once more toward the back of the room, toward the closed doors, And though Evelyn Carter was no longer visible, her presence remained, not as a memory that would fade, but as a standard that could not be ignored. He understood now that mastery was not something you declared, not something you displayed, but something you honored, quietly, consistently, without the need for recognition. He stepped away from the piano completely, leaving it alone beneath the soft glow of the stage lights, not abandoned, but returned to its purpose. The audience began to rise again, slowly, not in a coordinated gesture, but in quiet acknowledgement, each person carrying their own version of what they had just witnessed, their own realization, their own moment of clarity. There was no announcement to conclude the evening, no final words to summarize what had occurred, because anything spoken would have reduced it, would have attempted to define something that was meant to be felt, not explained. And as people made their way toward the exits, their footsteps softer than before, their voices subdued, there was a shared understanding that lingered beneath the surface of every thought. That night was not about a performance. It was about recognition, not of talent alone, but of humility, of awareness, of the quiet truth that the people we overlook often carry the very lessons we need the most. And long after the lights dimmed and the hall emptied, that truth remained, steady and undeniable, like a note that never truly fades, only waits to be heard again.